With that root bridge election, the first question that really comes to mind came to my mind 15 years ago or so when I first saw this term. It's like, okay, why do we call this a root bridge election when we're really electing root switches? What if we don't have any bridges? Are we still electing root bridges? This term just actually goes back to STP's pre-switch days because that's the term we used at the time because, of course, bridges are what we had. And the term stuck even after the move away from bridges to switches. So it's just one of those things. I go back and forth on occasion, call them a root bridge one second, a root switch the next. I try not to, but I do on occasion. Other people do it as well. So if you hear root bridge or root switch, we're talking about the same concept. Now, if this is the first time that you've ever seen this, there's a pretty good amount of theory here, and there are new terms here for you as well. So don't worry about not getting it all the first time. Because following the description of the process, we're going to go through a walkthrough on the board. I talk about two fully illustrated examples. The second one we're going to look at on the live Cisco switches. So just hang in there. If you need to watch the video more than once, which you probably will, you should watch all of them more than once. Just stick with that, and you will knock this stuff out like a champ on exam day. I just like to remind everybody that no one absorbs this all the first time around. People get down on themselves. Well, I couldn't remember everything. Hey, I don't remember everything of something new I see the first time. So don't be hard on yourself. Now, on to the election. Actually, we'll talk about people for a moment here. When people are born, they act like they are the center of the universe because to them, they don't know anything else. They just know that they're out here in a really bright lighted room all of a sudden, and whatever they want, they're going to yell for it. They're going to scream for it, and they expect to have their every desire carried out immediately. Now, some people grow out of this and some do not, and that's a topic for another course. But when our networks fire up or our switches fire up in our networks, a switch, when it first is powered on, believes that it is the root bridge for every virtual LAN on our network. Now, that would be fine if we only had one switch in our network, but we probably don't. So we have to have some kind of selection process. And actually, our selection process is an election process. And the election process is carried out by the exchange of something we call a BPDU, a Bridge Protocol Data Unit. Switches are continually sending or forwarding BPDUs, but hubs, repeaters, routers, servers, PCs, none of those devices send BPDUs. Now, one thing I do want to mention here, a real-world note. There are different types of BPDUs. You're only being introduced to one at this point. There's another one called a configuration BPDU. But the one we talk about 99% of the time really is technically called a Hello BPDU. The reason I'm telling you this is if you see the term simply BPDU, they're talking about a Hello BPDU, and I'm doing the same thing because I do not say Hello BPDU 300 times the next couple of minutes. So let's take a look at the contents of this BPDU and exactly what information it contains. First, it contains the root bridge's BID, the bridge ID, a vital concept when it comes to the root bridge election. The BID is a combination of the bridge's priority and its MAC address. Now, the format of the BID has the priority in front of the MAC. So the only way the MAC comes into play during the election is when the contending switch's priority is exactly the same. And in a lot of networks, that's how it gets decided. Now, the bridge with the lowest bid, not the highest bid, this is not an eBay auction, the bridge with the lowest bid is elected the root. The default priority value is a good thing to know. It's 32,768 plus the sysidx, the system ID extension, which just happens to be the VLAN number. So, for example, here's switch 1's priority for VLAN 1. Your switch will have different priorities for different VLANs. I took this from a screen from the switch, and we'll see that in a moment as well. But you can see here a bridge ID priority 32769. Whenever you see bridge ID, it's referring to the local device. And right next to it, it said priority 32768, sys ID extension 1. The same switch's priority for VLAN 100 is 32868, and where do they get that? The default priority of 32768 plus the sysidx 100. And if we have the live equipment up, yep, there we go. You can see the same thing here on a switch. Here it is for VLAN 1. I have show spanning VLAN 1 on a switch for our next lab. And you can see bridge ID. This is the information about the local bridge, the local switch, I should say. Priority 32769, you can see right there. It just adds the VLAN number to the priority, and that's it. Now again, the lowest bid wins, and the switch with the lowest MAC address will become the root bridge for all VLANs in the network, unless the priority is changed. We'll revisit that later, but that sounds like something we might want to change. The bid also contains the cost to reach the root from this bridge, because the path with the lowest overall cost to the root is the best path. That's how STP decides on that. Every port is assigned a cost relative to its speed. And you can see a couple of those live right here, because on VLAN 1, here's the cost for these two interfaces, Fast Ethernet 11 and 12. The cost is 19. That is the default cost for a Fast Ethernet port in STP. It's a good value to know. That default, again, is 19. It's also going to tell you the bid of the BPDU sender, who sent this. Now, the election proceeds as the BPDUs make their way among the switches. And here are the two possibilities right here, because a switch gets a BPDU, and what it does, it looks inside of it and says, okay, it compares the root bridge bid contained in that BPDU against its own. And, there are only two possibilities here. It's either lower or it's higher. Well, if the incoming root bridge bid is lower than that of the switch receiving it, that means that BPDU is indicating someone else is the root. This is what we call a superior BPDU because it has a winning bid inside of it. And in that case, the switch that receives it will then recognize that device as the root bridge. Now, if the incoming bid is higher than that of the receiver just looks at it and goes, I'm still the root, baby. I'm still in charge. A BPDU that carries a non-winning bid is an inferior BPDU. And these terms do come into play later in the section. They're good to remember. So again, a BPDU that carries a winning bid is superior, and one that doesn't, has a losing bid or a non-winning bid, if you want to be polite about it, is an inferior BPDU. That process is going to continue until every switch agrees on the root. And at that point, STP has reached a state of convergence. And I know I've used that term a couple times. You might not be familiar with it. Convergence is just a fancy way of saying everybody's agreed on something. If 5 people get together in the hallway and they decide what they want for lunch and they agree on it, some grudgingly I'm sure, but there is convergence. We've all agreed we're going to this place. Well, that's what we want in our routing protocols, and that's what we want in our switching protocols, is a state of convergence. Now, once all switches agree on who the root is, every port on every path is going to be in one of two modes, blocking, BLK, or forwarding, FWD. Now, here we have convergence with this router, and you can see that under status here, right next to that cost, is FWD for forwarding. We're coming up on labs where we go over all of this, but I like to show it live as we go along as well. So we're expecting to see FWD or BLK there. If we see LIS or LRN, then STP has not converged yet. And what the heck do I mean by LIS and LRN? Well, I mean a couple of intermediate STP port states that you really should be aware of. Because I mentioned that we don't go from blocking to forwarding immediately, and these listening and learning states are the ones in the middle. Now, in blocking state, obviously we're not forwarding any frames, but BPDUs are accepted by ports in blocking mode. It doesn't mean they're shut down, it's just that STP has blocked them for usage for that particular VLAN. In listening state, frames are not forwarded yet, and what we're doing here basically is some spring cleaning on the old MAC address table. We might have some stale entries in there. Entries that aren't heard from during this time, they're going right out the door. They're cleared right out. Now, learning is when we're basically restocking the MAC entry, because what do we do after spring cleaning? We always go out and buy more stuff, right? We bring something else in. Well, that's what the learning state is all about. Because again, frames are not yet being forwarded, but fresh MAC entries are being placed into the MAC table as frames enter the switch. Then we've got forwarding, which is where we're trying to get. Frames are being forwarded, and of course MAC addresses are still being learned. There is a fifth official STP state disabled. If you were putting them in order, I would say you would put disabled before all of these, but it's just what it sounds like. The port is actually disabled, and disabled ports cannot accept BPDUs. That's a big difference between blocking and disabled. Now, we're going to take two looks at STP in action, one on the board in the next video that has configs from live Cisco switches. We're going to compare the two there on the walkthrough. That's our pregame walkthrough. And then we're going to play the game with 3 switches in a lab, and we'll go through and see, what we think should have happened, and then I'll show you the commands to verify it as far as the root bridge goes. So a lot of great stuff in the next 2 videos. I'll see you there.